There we go. Okay. So first of all, I want to say thank you to ILSI for the invitation to come and speak with you today. And I'd also like to extend a special thanks to the American Society for Nutrition for sponsoring my participation in this meeting. So I was asked to talk about the topic of who is an expert and who gets to decide from the perspective of the panel selection process at the National Academies. So what I'm going to be doing today is talking to you about the process, but I hope also to give you some insight into the rationale behind that process. And I think that speaks to some of the issues that Sylvia brought forward. So I want to first disclose that I am employed by the National Academies as the director of the Food and Nutrition Board. I have no financial conflicts to declare. And I do want to say that any views expressed in this presentation are my own and do not necessarily represent or reflect the views of the National Academies. Having said that, my goal is, of course, to speak about the National Academies process. So let's begin by taking just a broad overview look at the National Academies process for selecting members of a consensus committee. So we begin with the premise that, first of all consensus committee members will have some level of intellectual bias. And these are biases that relate to the topic at hand, a topic under discussion. Those biases must be declared, balanced, and receptive to change in the face of evidence. Now, I'll speak about this a little bit more in a second, but from my perspective, there's no such thing as no bias whatsoever. And in fact, I wouldn't want a committee without some level of bias. I think it's important that everyone brings their intellectual if not biases, their intellectual views to the table, because that's the only way that you get a full discussion. The other point that is important that underscores our process is that the report conclusions and recommendations must be made by competent committees, but those committees' decisions and recommendations are easily undermined if an allegation of bias or conflict of interest arises. And those can arise from any number of things, whether they are real or perceived biases or conflicts. But it's really important that there is a screening process in place ahead of time to prevent that from happening. So in order for any of our consensus reports to be effective, they need to be as free from conflict of interest as possible and uncompromised by bias. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what constitutes that type of conflict and bias. So the expectation in terms of selecting for committees is that, first of all, we want to have a competent committee. We want to have a committee that is able to address the issues, the questions that are put before them, and to do that in a way that allows for full intellectual discourse. In order to do that, committee members are required to serve as individuals. So they come with their own intellectual expertise, not the expertise of another organization or group. They have to pass a certain test for conflict of interest, and any biases that they bring have to be minimized and balanced. So again, I want to return to this notion that nobody comes free of bias. The question is, what is the extent of the bias? Is it engendered in their intellectual work, or does it go beyond that? So there's a lot of depth to that question about what is bias, and it's up to the staff working within the Academy's process to try to make that clear. The other point is that as an individual, You cannot come to an Academies committee representing the organization or the group. And that's critical to ensuring the effectiveness of the deliberations, because if somebody is talking from the perspective of their organization, they're not working on the same intellectual level as the other members of the committee. So we can't have somebody trying to override the discussions of the committee because they're representing the biases of the organization. I want to add one more point to this, and that is that we've been asked many times, why can't you have a member from the sponsoring organization just sitting as a silent observer in the room? They're not participating in the discussion, they're not doing anything except sitting there. Well, that actually can be very intimidating. If you're a committee member and you're trying to have a discourse with other committee members and you see somebody in that room who you know is paying for that study, does that not, have some kind of influence over what you might feel comfortable in saying? So we say no to that notion that only the members of the committee are allowed in the room having the discussion. So the last point then that I would put forward as an expectation is that because our consensus studies are based on evidence-driven consensus, everybody must be able to objectively weigh the evidence and be open to conclusions that they differ significantly from those organizations from which they're affiliated. So you have to be able to step outside your role as somebody who's a member of an academic institution or an organization in order to really participate fully in those discussions. So how do we identify and assess bias? First of all, there are potential sources of bias that include different views or positions that are taken. These are, again, largely intellectually motivated, and again, I want to say that the last thing that I want as a study director is to have individuals who are so free of bias that they cannot fully participate in the intellectual discourse. The question is, what's the level of bias that is acceptable? Bias can arise from the close identification or association of an individual with a view or with a different group. And so this is a perceived bias. This is different than someone actually bringing their own personal bias. They may, in fact, not have that bias, but because of their affiliation or association with a group that's perceived as being biased, that unfortunately can carry over. That's a really difficult issue to wrestle with, and one that I think everybody who has, in our organization, who's directed a study has been faced with. And it's an ongoing issue that I think is really challenging. The other thing is that identification with positions or perspectives of that group can influence how other committee members perceive that individual as they're working within the committee construct. So, and then finally, that these types of biases do not necessarily disqualify an individual from participation. Again, it's a judgment call in terms of degree or extent that the bias could influence the discussion. So in order to make sure that a committee is fully competent, it's necessary to make sure that if there is a strong perceptive bias on one topic area, there's someone balancing it on the other so that you can have that discussion. You don't just have one view on a topic represented. So how do you identify and assess disqualifying biases? So the kind of rule of thumb that we use is if you have a bias that we call an intractable bias. And what that means is that the individual is so strongly holds their view that they cannot or will not release that view in a discussion with somebody else. So you've got to be able to set your own biases aside and listen to the other committee members and engage in discourse. And sometimes individuals change their minds, sometimes they don't. But if they're not willing to do that, that is an intractable bias, and that is, in my opinion, a clear disqualification for service. So accepting or being able to change your viewpoint is a question that we ask potential committee members before we proceed through the nomination process. And then again, I think I've already said this, but I want to emphasize it again, advocacy viewpoints, promoting causes or principles regardless of other perspectives is not appropriate and is not acceptable and is not something that is allowed in terms of bringing somebody forward for a nomination. So again, constructive discourse is what we need, and the only way to do that is to come with your intellectual bias, but controlled and able to discuss with other members. So what about conflicts of interest? That's a little bit different, and because a conflict of interest usually has a financial component to it. It doesn't always. Sometimes it's an intellectual conflict of interest, but more often than not, for our purposes, it's consideration of financial conflicts. And those financial conflicts if they could impair the individual's objectivity, if it could create an unfair or a competitive advantage for another person or an organization that they represent. So now there is an exception to this, and again, it's kind of rare, but it's something that we invariably will deal with in the course of our careers, and that is there may be a particular type of expertise or experience that is really critical to be able to respond to the questions or the challenges in the committee's task. And the committee member who is most needed or has the best expertise may have a conflict of interest that would otherwise be considered disqualifying. So what do we do in that situation? So we have to manage those conflicts, and those mean that you can have a conflict, but in order to make that in order for an individual to be impaneled that has a clear conflict, you have to be able to justify that their expertise is absolutely required on this committee, that you have to have it represented and represented within the course of the discussions. You have to also confirm that everyone with that expertise would also have a similar conflict, so that it doesn't single out one person. It means that this is an issue that must be considered. You have to demonstrate that you've exhausted all the other options and alternative routes to finding somebody with the expertise that's needed that doesn't have a conflict. So those are some very high bars. It's very unusual that you rise to the level of that type of overcoming a conflict, but it has happened, and it's happened in my career as well. One of the key points is that you must disclose these conflicts to stakeholders and to the public, and if you don't, then you lose credibility, the committee loses its credibility, and invariably the report and its recommendations lose their credibility. So the other thing I wanted to touch on just briefly was Connie had asked me to talk about a report that came out from the National Academies now almost 2 years ago, and that was a report that was directed towards HHS and USDA about redesigning the process for establishing the dietary guidelines. And the reason I think I was asked to talk about this was because it's, again, an illustration of transparency in our process. So the report, there were two reports. The first report is the one that I'm going to address today. We were asked to help the Dietary Guidelines Committee selection process to be a better process because it would be more transparent, it would eliminate intractable biases, and would include a range of viewpoints. So there are key messages that came out from this, and these are things I want you to take away from this and to keep in mind as we move forward to the discussion. So in order to enhance the integrity of the dietary guidelines process, the committee felt that it was important to support transparency in the nomination and selection process for the Dietary Guidelines Scientific Advisory Committee, that they had to promote diversity of experience and expertise. And so what this means is that you can't just go back and round up the usual suspects. You have to really reach out and find variance in expertise. So maybe you're stepping outside the usual role of nutrition or food science or food safety. Maybe you're including people who are up and coming in the field that haven't served before but certainly have something to contribute. You need to think about other types of expertise in age, ethnicity, geographic location, because even though it may not be apparent that those are important, it always comes through, at least in my experience, that there are different contributions that each of these areas makes, and I think it's important to bring that into the conversation. The other thing that the committee recommended was the need for a deliberative process, and you'll see this as we go through this piece of the talk. But this is including being adaptive, flexible, and continuous, in other words, supporting a continuous learning process. The other point, again, we brought up with the National Academies process, which is managing biases and conflicts. So you can't go forward and say, we have no bias, we have no conflict, but we are able to manage it. That's the key. And then, again, adopting state-of-the-art processes and methods, not returning to the same old ways of doing things. So the recommendations that were made, three basic recommendations were made. First is to employ an external third party that would review and narrow the candidate pool. So if you're familiar with the process that the agencies have taken thus far, it is that they go through and nominate individuals, screen them, and then they go through an appointment process. So the recommendation was to take that out of the agency's hands and put it into the hands of a third party. This third party would take care of screening and then putting forward the list of nominees, but the criteria for the nominees would stay within the control of the agencies. And I think that's kind of an important point because, if you could get a third party who has no idea who the nominees are, what the expertise is that's needed. So I think it's really important to be able to keep that in the hands of the agencies, that they would determine the criteria. The second thing is to make a list of the provisional appointees for public comment. And so this means including short biographies and any known conflicts, and the public comment would occur for some reasonable period of time. In the National Academies process, we post biosketches, and these are biosketches that are similar to what you would see posted on any academic website. So they're not deeply, personal. They're biosketches of an individual's qualifications. The reasonable period of time, in our judgment, is 20-day public comment period. Then thirdly, the recommendation was to disclose how the biases and conflicts are identified and how they are managed. So let's look at the recommendations and whether or not they were implemented. I want to say at this point that I am not making any kind of judgments or assessments about whether or not the agencies should have implemented a recommendation. I'm simply reporting what was or was not done. And this information is available on USDA's website. So they have made public what they have and have not done with regard to implementing the report recommendations. So the recommendation, first recommendation about employing the third party to review and narrow the candidate pool What the agencies did was they accepted public comment on the topics and the scientific questions, and I think you know that happened in the fall of 2019. And then they developed screening criteria and they set up an independent website, but they did not employ a third party to actually screen nominees for service on the committee. And the reason given was cost and time. And if you think about it, when the report was released, the 2020 DGA process had already been underway. So that really was an issue. The second recommendation was to make a list of provisional appointees and their biographies for public comment, and this was not implemented out of privacy concerns. I can't give you any details about what that specific issue was. The only thing I can say is that, again, at the Academies, what we do is we post a bio sketch. If there are conflicts of interest, we don't post any deep details. We just say that an individual is affiliated with organization X or Y that may be a perceived conflict. So the third recommendation was to disclose how nominees' biases and conflicts are managed. There were specific action steps that were recommended. First was to create and publicly post a policy to disclose the financial and non-financial biases and conflicts. The second was to develop a management plan for addressing biases and conflicts. The third was to certify that a federal ethics officer was giving an independent review and judging the biases and conflicts of interest from an independent perspective. And then, very importantly, to document how the conflicts of interest were managed presumably in the report, in the Dietary Guidelines report. Now, the actions that were implemented were, I guess I'm running short on time, were that they did implement steps to ensure through their own internal process a review, but they did not publicly post financial conflicts, and they did not post the biographies. And then lastly was a continuous process improvement, and that, again, that was an internal process that was implemented. I'm going to rush through because I know I'm at time. So this is one slide I wanted to share with you. This is far too much information to go into here, but I want to show it to you for two reasons. Number one, the committee's view was that the best way to improve this process was to make it continuous, ongoing process, as opposed to discrete every 5 years starting all over again. The way they do that is by introducing a dietary guidelines, planning, and continuity committee, and this committee would screen not only nominees, but would screen topics. And that committee would feed their information back into the Scientific Advisory Committee, separating those two processes and relieving the Scientific Advisory Committee from any kind of perceived biases by doing it all themselves. The other point I want to make here is that the committee's recommendations introduced a number of places where you could have greater transparency and more opportunities for public input. And again, that they felt would greatly enhance the process. So with that kind of rapid run through, this just compares basically the continuous and the 5-year cycle. The point is that either one could be made in a way, could be set up in a way that increases both trust and transparency. And then finally, I wanted to just kind of reiterate the points that I made earlier about the National Academies process. We are guided by the Federal Advisory Committee Act, but we have an exemption, which is Section 15, and that exemption allows committees to meet in closed session Otherwise, the FACA rules are everything is open to the public. But by meeting in closed session, as I said it earlier, that allows committees to deliberate in an open process with themselves and frees them from any concerns that somebody is watching over their work. So who is an expert and who gets to decide? From the perspective of the nominee, the expert demonstrates their expertise in their ability to respond to the questions in the task. They express viewpoints that are grounded in evidence, not in advocacy. They are open to contrasting viewpoints within the context of the committee discussion on the topic of interest, and they demonstrate freedom from financial conflicts. Who gets to decide? The agency or organization, and they do that by screening for potential biases and conflicts, screening very carefully. They consider the full range of input, including public comment, before they impanel a committee member. They seek counterbalancing views when they know biases are represented and needed in order to answer the questions. They monitor for changes in circumstances and annually recertify people by doing a continuous bias and conflict screening. So the takeaway messages: number one, clear conflicts of interest must be identified, including financial, personal, and professional. Number two, biases in viewpoints are expected, but they must be balanced. Number three, publicly disclose competing interests, and I think that's very important. And number four, following up with a review at least once yearly. So with that, I will say thank you, and I apologize for going over.